I walked into my sister's wedding expecting love and family. Instead, I was quietly sent to sit in a hallway. No explanation, no apology. So I made a choice that no one expected. And once I walked out, everything changed. The music reached me before the sight did, soft violins mixed with polite applause, and laughter trapped inside crystal glasses. As I stood at the edge of the ballroom doors breathing in lilies and expensive perfume, while warm golden light spilled across the marble floor, and when the wedding coordinator glanced at my name and pointed down the corridor saying hallway seating with a tight professional smile, the word hallway echoed louder than the vows because beyond her shoulder I saw white tablecloths, flickering candles, and rows of chairs filled with cousins, co-workers, and strangers who shared no blood, while I was guided into a narrow cold corridor, buzzing with fluorescent lights, stacked chairs, and the sharp smell of cleaning chemicals, sitting on a metal chair that pressed into my back as muffled vows leaked through the wall, laughter turning into a dull ache, my phone vibrating with messages asking where I was sitting, while I stared at the red exit sign and wiped damp palms on my dress. Memories of helping my sister choose this place rising uninvited as applause shook the wall for the kiss I did not witness, until clarity replaced humiliation and I stood, the chair screeching as I walked past servers and echoes toward the heavy exit door, pushing it open into cool night air smelling of rain and asphalt, my lungs finally filling as the ceremony continued without me. My phone ringing unanswered while gravel crunched under my shoes, headlights passing as I kept walking, the empty hallway and glowing sign burned into my mind, and when I sat on a stone wall outside with my heart steadying and messages lighting my screen asking where I went, fast, uneven footsteps approached from behind and a familiar, breathless voice called my name while I stayed still, letting the night hold its breath with me. The night air pressed against my skin as that familiar voice hovered behind me, sharp with panic and disbelief, and I recognized the rhythm of my sister's breathing before I fully turned, because guilt always announced itself through her breath long before her words arrived, and when I faced her the glow from the parking lights cut across her white dress, now creased and shadowed, mascara trembling at the edges of lashes that had been perfect minutes ago, and she asked why I left as though the answer was not already written into the narrow hallway she had assigned me, as though the metal chair and fluorescent lights had not spoken clearly enough, and I felt the cold of the stone wall beneath my palms while I told her calmly that I sat exactly where I was placed and simply chose not to stay there. And her eyes flicked back toward the venue as if approval might still be retrieved if she moved fast enough, explaining in rushed fragments about seating plans, about pressure, about how complicated weddings become, each excuse thin and brittle, and while she spoke I noticed details I had never allowed myself to see before, the way her hands shook, not from concern for me but from fear of embarrassment, the way her smile kept trying to return and failing, the way the music leaking through the open doors sounded hollow now, like joy playing in the wrong key. And in that moment, I understood that this was never about one chair or one hallway. It was about a pattern that had been repeating quietly for years. Birthdays where my presence was optional, holidays where my opinions arrived last, conversations where my needs were acknowledged only after everyone else had finished speaking. And I told her that the hallway was not an accident but a message, one that finally reached me clearly, and she recoiled as if struck, insisting she never meant to hurt me. Insisting family mattered, insisting I was being dramatic. Words so familiar they felt rehearsed, blending into the night noise of engines and distant laughter. And when she reached for my arm, I stepped back, the movement small but final. Shock rippling across her face because she had expected forgiveness to arrive automatically. An unspoken tradition like cake cutting or bouquet tossing. And behind her figures began to gather, silhouettes of relatives and friends drawn by tension the way people gather around accidents, whispers fluttering, eyes measuring, judgments forming without facts, and someone asked loudly if everything was fine, the false cheer in the question cutting deeper than honesty ever could, and my sister nodded too quickly, her smile snapping into place like a mask worn too long, while I remained still, my silence louder than any scene I could create, because I understood then that leaving had already changed the story and staying quiet now would only rewrite it again. And I spoke with steady clarity, explaining that love without respect becomes decoration, that presence without belonging becomes performance, and the words seemed to slow time as they landed, some guests looking away, others stiffening, a few appearing confused as if witnessing a language they had never learned, and I felt no triumph, only a strange lightness, as if a weight I had carried since childhood had finally loosened its grip, and my sister's expression shifted from confusion to fear as she realized the audience was listening. That control had slipped, and she whispered my name again, softer this time, asking me to talk later, asking me not to do this here. And I answered that here was exactly where it belonged, because this place had already decided where I belonged. And the quiet that followed stretched until even the music inside seemed to hesitate, and in that pause memories flooded me in sharp flashes, lending money never repaid, apologies never given, promises postponed until forgotten, and I understood that this wedding was not the cause but you. The mirror, reflecting years of imbalance back at me with brutal clarity, and as murmurs rose again, some supportive, some critical, I felt the pull of old habits urging me to soften, to protect everyone else from discomfort, yet something held me firm, a resolve born from finally seeing my own worth without comparison, and I watched my sister search my face for the version of me that would fold, that would smooth things over, that would take the hallway and smile anyway, and when she did not find it, her shoulders sagged as though the night itself had grown heavier, and a voice behind her cleared its throat, the groom stepping forward with an expression carefully neutral, offering a polite apology about logistics and misunderstandings, his tone distant, the kind reserved for acquaintances, and that was when understanding struck deepest, that I had been managed rather than welcomed, categorized rather than cherished, and I thanked him calmly, because anger no longer felt necessary, and I told them both that I was leaving not out of spite but clarity, that sometimes walking away was the only way to arrive somewhere honest, and I turned toward the street again, as whispers swelled into full conversation behind me, speculation blooming, narratives forming that I could not control and no longer wished to, and with each step the noise softened, the night reclaiming its stillness, my phone buzzing again with messages multiplying, some demanding explanations, others offering concern too late, and I ignored them all, focusing instead on the rhythm of my breath and the steady beat of my heart, realizing that for the first time it was not racing to keep up with anyone else. And as I reached the corner and the venue lights faded behind me, I sensed that the aftermath had already begun inside. Questions asked, loyalties tested, stories retold with shifting emphasis, a family forced to confront a discomfort long avoided, and I knew that my absence would echo louder than my presence ever had. I walked for a long time after that, past closed shops and quiet houses, past windows glowing with other people's lives, until the sounds of celebration were completely gone and the city settled into a low, steady hum, and with every step the events of the night replayed in my mind not as chaos but as clarity, each moment aligning like pieces of a picture I had avoided finishing for years, and I realized how often I had mistaken endurance for loyalty, how many times I had stayed silent to keep peace that never truly included me. And the thought did not bring bitterness but understanding, because patterns only continue when they remain unspoken. And tonight they had been named simply by my absence, and when I finally stopped walking, my legs trembled, not from fear but release, and I sat on a bench beneath a streetlight, its pale glow pooling around my shoes, my dress wrinkled now without ceremony, and I breathed deeply, noticing how the air felt lighter when I was not whole. Ding, words back, and my phone buzzed again, a message from my mother this time, asking where I had gone, asking if I realized how embarrassing the situation had become, and I stared at the screen until the words blurred, recognizing the familiar framing, concern filtered through image, care measured by appearance, and I did not respond, because for the first time I understood that explanations had never changed the outcome, only my boundaries would, and as the night stretched on more messages arrived, some angry, some pleading, some confused, and a few unexpectedly supportive relatives who had noticed the hallway long before I spoke, who had wondered why I accepted so little, and their quiet validation settled in my chest like a steady warmth, and I realized that silence often hides allies as well as truths, and when dawn finally approached, the sky softened from black to gray, the city exhaling as morning prepared to arrive, and I found myself standing by my window at home with my shoes still on, watching pale light spill across empty streets, the quiet feeling earned rather than lonely, because I had chosen myself without spectacle, without cruelty, simply by refusing a place that diminished me. The days that followed unfolded slowly, deliberately, like pages turned with care, conversations beginning where silence once lived, some relationships fracturing under the weight of honesty, others reshaping into something more equal, and my sister and I spoke at last without roles or expectations, only truth spoken awkwardly and imperfectly, her admitting fear of confrontation, me admitting exhaustion from carrying understanding alone. And though nothing returned to what it had been, something steadier took its place, because clarity, once claimed, does not retreat quietly. And when I thought back to the hallway with its cold lights and metal chair, it felt distant, like a place I once passed through but never belonged to. And I understood that walking out had not been an act of loss but of arrival, a quiet decision that redirected my life toward rooms where my presence mattered without explanation. And as time moved forward, and the wedding became a story retold with softened edges and selective memory, I held on to what mattered. The knowledge that dignity does not require permission, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is the one made without shouting, simply by standing up and leaving. And though that night had begun with music and flowers and celebration, it ended with something far rarer, the calm certainty of choosing a life where I was never placed last, and that certainty stayed with me, steady and unshakable, long after the echoes of the wedding faded into memory. By the time dawn softened the edges of the city, I found myself standing by my window with my shoes still on, watching pale light spill across empty streets, and the silence felt earned rather than lonely, because my phone had finally gone quiet after hours of messages. It ranged from anger to apology to confusion, and I understood that every reaction carried the same truth, that my absence had forced a reckoning words never could, and in the days that followed, conversations changed their tone. Some bridges cracked beyond repair while others shifted into something more honest, my sister and I speaking at last without roles or expectations, only truth spoken slowly and imperfectly. And though nothing returned to what it had been, something steadier took its place, because I no longer measured my worth by seating charts or approval. And when I thought back to the hallway with its cold lights and metal chair, it felt distant, like a place I once passed through but never belonged to. And I realized that walking out had not been an act of loss but of arrival, a quiet decision that redirected my life toward rooms where my presence mattered, without explanation. And as the sun rose fully and the city began to move again, I breathed deeply, knowing that some endings do not close with noise or revenge, but with clarity, dignity, and the calm certainty of choosing a space where you are never placed last. In the weeks that followed, the story did not settle the way people expected it to, because moments like that do not end when the lights go out or when the music stops. They continue quietly, threading themselves through ordinary days, and I noticed how often my mind returned to small details rather than the confrontation itself. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, the weight of the metal chair, the way my name had sounded when spoken with urgency for the first time only after I left, and these details followed me into grocery stores, into morning commutes, into conversations that had nothing to do with weddings, and I realized that shock does not always arrive as a single explosion. Sometimes it arrives as recognition, delayed but persistent, asking to be acknowledged again and again. At work, colleagues commented on how calm I seemed, unaware that calm can be the surface of something newly solid rather than something fragile, and I found myself speaking more directly, declining requests without apology, expressing preferences without cushioning them in humor, and each small assertion felt connected to that night, as though leaving the hallway had unlocked a door I had not known existed, and I began to notice how often people test boundaries gently at first, with assumptions rather than demands, and how often I had allowed those assumptions to stand simply because correcting them felt inconvenient. And this awareness was not heavy, it was clarifying, like adjusting a lens until the picture sharpens. My sister called again one evening, her voice quieter than before, stripped of ceremony, and she asked if we could talk without defending ourselves, without revising history, just to understand. And I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see what honesty looked like without urgency pressing. against it, and when we met she did not bring explanations, she brought questions, asking when she had stopped seeing me clearly, asking why she assumed I would accept less, and I told her the truth without accusation, that patterns become invisible to those who benefit from them, that love does not erase hierarchy unless someone actively challenges it, and she listened in a way she had not before, not interrupting, not reframing, and I could see how uncomfortable that listening was for her, how it forced her to confront versions of herself she preferred not to examine. She admitted that seating me in the hallway had felt easier than negotiating with others, that she assumed I would understand, that I always had, and there it was, the sentence that explained more than she realized, and I told her that understanding should not be confused with consent, that endurance should not be mistaken for agreement. And she nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction, as if learning a new language, and we sat with that discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it, because resolution too quickly achieved often dissolves just as fast. Other family members reacted differently, some avoiding the subject entirely, others reframing it as drama I had caused, and I learned how quickly narratives shift to protect comfort, how often people prefer a flawed piece over an honest disruption, and this knowledge no longer surprised me, it simply informed my choices, guiding where I invested energy and where I withdrew it, and withdrawal no longer felt like punishment, it felt like alignment. The wedding photos began appearing online, carefully curated, smiles frozen in frames that excluded absence, and I studied them briefly before closing the app, aware that images tell only what they are meant to tell, and that truth often lives outside the frame, and I felt no urge to correct the record publicly because my decision had never been about visibility, it had been about integrity, and integrity does not require witnesses to exist. As months passed, the hallway became a metaphor people used lightly, jokingly, as if distance could turn discomfort into humor, and I allowed those jokes to pass without engagement because some lessons resist dilution, and I did not want to participate in making mine smaller, and instead I focused on building a life that reflected the clarity I had gained. Friendships where mutuality was practiced rather than promised. Spaces where my presence was assumed rather than negotiated. I noticed how my body responded differently in rooms now, shoulders less tense, breath deeper, as though my nervous system recognized safety more quickly when it was no longer scanning for dismissal, and this physical ease confirmed what my mind had already accepted, that belonging is not something to be earned through silence, it is something that emerges when respect is present. Occasionally, someone would ask directly if I regretted leaving, framing the question as "see you." Curiosity but carrying expectation beneath it, and I would answer honestly that I regretted staying as long as I had. That the hallway had merely revealed what years of smaller moments had already shown, and this answer often unsettled them because it challenged the idea that endurance is always virtuous, and I understood that discomfort, because I had lived inside it for years. My sister and I continued to talk sporadically, conversations less frequent but more deliberate, and though closeness did not return to its former shape, something more stable replaced it, a relationship without assumed sacrifice, without unspoken debts, and I learned that not all repairs restore the original structure, some create something new entirely, and that newness carries its own unfamiliar steadiness. One afternoon, months later, I attended another family gathering, smaller and quieter, and when I arrived, a chair was pulled out for me without comment, without hesitation, and the gesture was simple but meaningful, not because of the chair itself, but because it was offered without calculation, and I accepted it without gratitude because respect does not require acknowledgement to exist, and sitting there I felt neither triumphant nor wary, only present. The hallway still appeared in my thoughts from time to time, not as a wound but as a marker, a line dividing before and after, and I understood that some moments function that way, not dramatic in themselves but catalytic in their clarity, and I grew grateful for the discomfort because it had forced a choice I might otherwise have postponed indefinitely.